The remaining prophets in the Old Testament are gathered together at the end of our printed Old Testaments. The thing is that Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Daniel were all long enough documents to occupy a scroll each back when it was all done on scrolls. But the remaining 12 canonical prophets could all be written onto a single scroll. And that's how they were preserved right from late Old Testament times, and they were known as the Book of the 12. In English they're often referred to as the minor prophets. This title is only really intended to refer to the length of their books, but it sounds so much as if it's judging the quality or the significance of their work, and if it sounds like that, then it's seriously misleading. We've already dealt with 3 of them as major figures in the development of Old Testament prophecy. Amos, the first of the canonical prophets, setting the tone of most of the prophets of doom. Hosea, who uncovered the father heart of God in such a way as to make it clear that his wrath could never be his last word on his people's unfaithfulness. And Micah, the country boy that everyone usually forgets. The logic of Hosea's burden is taken up powerfully by Jeremiah, prophesying the coming of a new covenant, and the next figure in that succession is Jesus, which shows that Hosea played an epoch-making role every bit as much as Amos did. Minor they are not. Well, today we're going to look through the rest of the 12, giving at least some headlines to each of them. First of all, the prophet Joel. Joel consists of 2 sections, a description of a plague of locusts assailing Jerusalem and its surrounding countryside, and then looking forward to a new stage in the outworking of God's purpose. We'll look at what he says later, but we better start with trying to work out who Joel is and when he ministered. Who he was is virtually impossible to say. The name Joel means Yahweh is God, and it's fairly common. There are 12 other Joels in the Old Testament, and we can't connect this prophet with any one of them. So, and there's nothing in his book which helps to identify him. So that's drawn a blank. When he wrote is a different matter, though. I thought you might be interested to work through this question for once, looking at most of the evidence and seeing what conclusion we can draw. Quite a lot of the relevant evidence is available to us through just reading an English translation of the book. Let's go through it by stages. First of all, he usually refers to the Lord's people under the names of Jerusalem and Judah, but he occasionally uses the name Israel apparently as an equivalent to Judah. If he'd lived during the divided kingdoms, he couldn't have done that because Israel would have referred to the other lot. So that rules out the period from just after Solomon, at 933 BC, up to the fall of Samaria in 721. Then he refers to the people responsible for what's going on in Jerusalem as priests and elders. Well, the only period in which this would have been appropriate would have been after the return from exile in Babylon. In the time before the exile, any prophet would have blamed the king for the ills of the nation, not the priests and elders. Then in his vision of the locusts, he has them running along the wall. Well, they couldn't have done that, really, until after Nehemiah had seen to the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, that is after 445 BC. The fact that he describes priests as ministering at the altar also requires this period, because by Nehemiah's time the temple had long been rebuilt. In chapter 3 verse 6 the Greeks are mentioned, but there's no hint that they're the world's superpower which they became after Alexander the Great's conquests in 336 to 323 BC. So that suggests for us a date somewhere between 445 BC and 336. And this is confirmed if you chase phrases in Joel which appear to be quoting other prophets. A number of times he uses a phrase which would appear to have become current because of the ministry of another prophet, and examples of this include echoes of Obadiah and Malachi, both of whom most scholars would date somewhere in the middle of the 5th century BC. If their work had had time to become regarded as quotable in something of the manner of quoting scripture, that would make a date of at least 400 BC for Joel seem comfortable. Now, it is of course possible that these arguments lead to a conclusion which is not true. I've rehearsed them here in detail to give you a flavour of the kind of way in which it's possible to go about suggesting a date for a book. As it happens, with Joel there isn't any other evidence from outside of the book as to when it was written or by whom, so the sort of evidence I've laid before you is all there is to go on, apart from highly expert dating of the kind of Hebrew language used in the book, and that does tend to confirm the sort of date that we've arrived at. Okay, let's look at what Joel says. First of all, the locusts. Joel chapter 1 suggests to me that he's describing an actual plague of locusts which hit Jerusalem. In that chapter he calls for mourning simply because what has happened has been so terrible and has so devastated the life of the city and of the temple. In the beginning of chapter 2 he's issuing a call for an invasion, which sounds like another plague of locusts, but this time it seems to be picturing the army of the Lord invading the city. I have an idea that what he's doing here is in fact looking at the same event, but summoning people to interpret it as something which the Lord has done. That of course only makes sense if the Lord did it in response to generations of unfaithfulness. So Joel lifts the summons from a description of the invading army to a call for repentance in chapter 2, verses 12 to 17. Verses 18 to 27 give us then a prophetic reassurance. The Lord does want to get past the present time of wrath. His long-term plans for his people are for a time of blessing and peace, when he himself will repay them for the years that the locusts have eaten. The rest of the book of Joel, then, is after the locusts. It looks for a time when this graciousness of the Lord will be taken a great deal further, a time where things will be put right, possibly in a final sense. Chapter 2, verses 28 to 32 is the famous passage which Peter quoted on the day of Pentecost, and the main burden of it is this. Up to now there's been very much first-class and second-class citizens as far as concerns people's relationship with the Lord. The prophets have been the first-class lot. They've been able to stand in the counsel of the Lord. They've known from inside of themselves how the Lord sees the world. Although it risks sounding heretical, they've had a relationship with the Lord which has not depended on the law of Moses even, or on going through the prescribed religious rituals. They each had their own direct line to the Lord. But now, in each generation, there have only been 1 or 2 or 3 prophets, but never more. But what the Lord is going to do is to take that relationship he's had with the prophets and make it the norm for all the people. He will pour out his Spirit on all of them, so that men and women, young and old, masters and servants, will all alike relate to him, as previously only the prophets have done. As I read Joel, I would say that Joel's own assumption was that pouring out the Lord's Spirit on all flesh meant on all Jewish flesh. Luke tells us in Acts how this prophecy began to be fulfilled among the Jews gathered in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. But he then tells us in the following chapters how those apostles, who were Jews, discovered as they went along that the Lord was beginning to pour out his Spirit also on the Gentiles, as he did on us at the beginning. So whatever Joel thought about this being restricted to the Jews, I think the Lord had a bigger idea in mind. You can see how restricted was Joel's vision if you look on to chapter 3. If you go back to Isaiah, the vision in Isaiah 2, the one that he shares with Micah, has the end times seeing Jerusalem lifted up in the sight of the nations, so that the nations will stream to Jerusalem in order to turn to the God whom the people there worship. But Joel 3 is altogether different. Here the nations appear on the scene only to be judged and condemned. The Lord will pardon Israel, but not the others. Well, I think we have to say that Joel got it wrong. Otherwise, what hope is there for the likes of us? But there is some excuse for it. Isaiah's prophecy was in the 8th century BC, when notions of Israel and Judah suffering at the hands of foreigners were just the things that prophets said. It wasn't something that was actually happening. But by the time of Joel, all the people had experienced these things happening to them, happening to their ancestors. And it's only too understandable that they found it hard to see how nations which had so maltreated Israel should later be recipients of anything but the Lord's wrath. In 1942, my mother's sister Gladys wanted to marry her fiancé George. But George's parents were first-generation immigrants from Germany. My grandfather had suffered life-changing injuries during the First World War, so he couldn't cope with his daughter marrying a German. And to be fair, in 1942, when this took place, Adolf wasn't doing anything to improve the reputation of Germans here. Well, the wedding went ahead, but Gladys's elder brother had to give her away, as her father couldn't bear even to be at the wedding. You see, even someone who could hear the Lord like Joel did was clearly beset by a weakness similar to that understandable weakness of my grandfather. And this, by the way, is often adduced as just another piece of evidence that Joel should be dated sometime after the return to Jerusalem. Well, that's what I have to say at the moment about Joel, and we'll move on to Obadiah. The name Obadiah means servant of the Lord. Like with Joel, there are about a dozen Obadiahs in the Old Testament, and there's no convincing identification of this one with any of the others. So we haven't a clue as to who this Obadiah was, or where or when he fitted into what. So we're left with getting clues from the tiny quantity of text in this, the shortest book in the Old Testament. Obadiah is a one-hit wonder. The underlying plot is about the nation of Edom. The Edomites were those who it says were descended from Jacob's brother Esau, so they were sort of brothers to the Israelites, but very clearly estranged brothers. I mean, you can see that in verse 12. The idea is that Edom is getting its comeuppance. Too often they've acted against Israel in wars and raids, and now they're getting clobbered by those who had previously been their allies. What's the connection between this happening to the nation of Edom and Obadiah saying what he does? One possibility is that the attack on Edom is already underway and Obadiah is announcing its spiritual significance. Another possibility is that the attack is imminent. It's obviously going to happen. It only takes a modest amount of political acumen to see that it's coming, and Obadiah is giving his commentary on what it all means. Another possibility is that Obadiah is giving this prophecy because his awareness of an attack coming relies entirely on what the Lord has revealed to him. He wouldn't know anything about it if the Lord hadn't told him. And in that case, the attack could still be in the future from Obadiah's standpoint, probably in the not too distant future, because prophets tended to talk about stuff that was in their own day or only a bit afterwards. Whichever those possibilities you go to, and all three are possible, the best way to date Obadiah is to consult historians for them to offer such defeats of Edom as they know about, and then to assume that Obadiah had to have ministered at about that time. Well, it won't surprise you that in the chaos of Middle Eastern politics there are several possibilities to choose from, and that leaves us at the mercy of other experts like the linguists, but the linguists can't tell you anything very definite because there's so little text to go on in this book, and it seems that something like 450 BC is a date that lurks around, that no one has sort of proved wrong. As to what Obadiah actually says, it's not unlike Joel. There will come a time where the Lord will sort out all the nations. Jerusalem will be okay and will be a place of safety for its people. But it will be hard for all other nations, not least for those who have a history of being rotten to the Jews. The same comments apply here then as we made concerning Joel, that this aspect of the prophecy is eclipsed by what the Lord has done and said since then. One other thing which gives us a glimpse both of dating and of this prophet's relationship to other prophets is that Obadiah has a number of phrases which seem to echo especially things that Jeremiah said. Well, most certainly by 450 BC, the words of Jeremiah would have been known and respected, at least by those who had a reason to take prophecy seriously, so that fits. And there are some verses in Obadiah which are fairly closely matched by verses in Joel. One example is that Obadiah verse 17 seems to be pretty much Joel 2 verse 32. The usual theory is that Joel is quoting Obadiah. Well, if Obadiah ministered around 450 BC, that fits with our ideas about the dating of Joel being sometime after 440. So there's lots of ifs and buts in there, but they're unavoidable, and no more certainty than that is really available to us. So that ends the first batch of the remaining members of the Book of the 12. And we'll resume with the second batch when you're ready. Let's then move on to the book of Jonah. Perhaps the most interesting thing to do with this little book is to ask in what sense it's true. We'll get there by stages after considering some other examples. I'm assuming that our most obvious starting point is a view of Scripture as being the inspired Word of God. Most of you will have been taught to apply to it the ideas of Psalm 119, that every bit of it is perfect. You will assume that every verse is directly revelatory of God's Word to us, and I think that's a good starting point. But I think it needs touching up a little by those who are prepared to do a bit of thinking. Start at Luke 10, verse 30. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Is that true? Did this happen? In what way is that parable true? Well, presumably it's true to life, in that its components are accurate reflections of how things were at the time. You'd say that sort of thing about a good historical novel. Its truth really depends on the way that the storyline impacts your conscience, not on whether precisely that related chain of events actually took place. In fact, most of us assume that it's a story that Jesus made up for teaching purposes. Let's move to Revelation 7, verses 13 and 14. Then one of the elders asked me, "These in white robes, who are they, and where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." That second verse, verse 14, can it be true? In what sense is it true? Presumably it's true by taking the significance behind the two images of white robes and washed in the blood of the Lamb, and relating together those significances, whereas the two images themselves are absolute nonsense when they're merged. If you washed white robes in the blood of the Lamb, by the time they'd dried, they'd be a dirty brown colour. So the truth of this passage depends on your grasping what is behind the images, and the images themselves may or may not resemble what is going to happen in the last days. Or let's take another one that's got a little bit of a twist in them. Psalm 137, the last two verses, verses 8 and 9. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is he who repays you for what you have done to us, he who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Is that true? In what sense is it true? Certainly not as a revelation of the heart of God to us. At best, it's an honest admission of what was going on in the exiles' minds, something which fell seriously short of the Lord's own attitude. I mean, he sent his son to die for the sort of people who are being cursed in this verse. The picture's not quite as simple as some preaching suggests, is it? Let's go to Luke 16 from verse 22. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In hell, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away, with Lazarus by his side, and he called to him, Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire. Is this true? In what way is it true? Is there this kind of communication between an inhabitant of hell and Father Abraham? You see, I think Jesus is making a funny. It would appear to be a story which Jesus is making up, although with all too familiar correspondence to the way in which the rich do so often treat the poor. But as a device, presumably to make more people listen to what he's saying, he takes the story through an absurd sequence of events. I don't think he's expecting people to assume that this kind of communication can take place between heaven and hell. But if it could, let's listen to what might be said. Perhaps Jesus didn't do it quite deliberately as a funny. Perhaps he was just the sort of character from whom it sometimes came out in that way. They did say he was a great character to have at a party. Now, what about Jonah? Even if we suppose that the great fish means a whale, who seriously believes that a man could survive inside such an animal at sea for 3 days? Where would he get his oxygen supply? Why wouldn't he drown? And again, how far could a man walk in 3 days? Well, 3 miles an hour, 7 hours a day? What's that, 63 miles? Do you believe that Nineveh was something like 63 miles across? That's something like 3 times the size of London. This story is fantasy. I'd go further. I'd say it was farce. It contains detail after detail which is deliberately exaggerated for its humorous effect. People are not supposed to believe that Nineveh was 3 days' walk in diameter. It's supposed to sound like a fairy story, as a crazy way of describing the size of a confessedly large city, but nothing like that large. The main storyline is then of a prophet who has a genuine gift of prophecy. He can hear what the Lord is saying, but he'd rather sulk or even emigrate than deliver the message. This is almost Keystone Cop stuff. No? And then the entire city of Nineveh, king and people, repent the moment they hear the word of Jonah, and they become devotees of Yahweh. Now, I think it's fair to assume that if any such thing had ever happened in Nineveh, it would at least have left some sort of mark in the history books of at least one of the nations in the Middle East. But there's not a thing apart from the book of Jonah. Presumably the point of the book is that the Lord is ready and able to make his word heard among foreign nations, even amongst those who are most established in a position of hounding his own people, and he is able to bring them to faith. It may be a fantastic thing to contemplate, so it's quite appropriate to communicate it in a fantastic story. And it might not be how you or I would rule the world, hence Jonah's sulking. But you better believe that it's on the Lord's heart and in the Lord's repertoire, and that you've got a part to play in it. Now this message was presumably relevant when the sort of prophecy that people were getting was from the likes of Joel and Obadiah, who, as we've seen, had a massive blind spot when it came to the Lord's purpose for Gentile nations. A language study of Jonah indeed places the book somewhere in the 400 to 200 BC period, so that would be after those other prophets. So, an anonymous prophet becomes seriously burdened that his fellow prophets for some generations have got this detail desperately wrong. How does he communicate that? By standing up and publicly condemning Joel and Obadiah and others? If those people were already acknowledged as having been prophets, and if their attitude to foreign nations was what the bulk of the ordinary people thought anyway, that sort of confrontational approach wouldn't get anywhere. So how could this prophet discharge his duty of getting a hearing for what the Lord was telling him? And he then hit upon it. He published a satirical piece, full of titters, showing the utter absurdity of the position that he was opposing. I remember it stuck in my mind at the time when the war against Iraq was in the offing. Bremner, Bird and Fortune, who did a regular spot on the television of political satire, they did a piece in which one of them was producing a dossier of evidence that Saddam had large quantities of weapons of mass destruction. The evidence that he adduced was that we still have the receipts. That's the same spirit as Jonah. A serious point to make, but made with a titter. And we move on in a moment to Nahum. We know nothing at all about Nahum the man. Nahum, the first verse of his book, is the only place in the Bible where that name occurs. He's described as an Elkoshite. Presumably that means someone who comes from Elkosh, but no one knows where that is. So we can do a little better about when he lived. Nahum 3 verse 8 refers to the fall of the major Egyptian city of Thebes. Well, we know that happened in 663 BC, so Nahum must have been after that. The whole book is foretelling the fall of Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, so it must have been spoken before that city fell in 612 BC. So Nahum ministered between those dates, 663 to 612, but he appears to be a clear-cut one-hit wonder, so his ministry could have occupied a few days or a few weeks at any time during that period. So his message is the comforting assurance that Nineveh, the source of so much aggro for Israel, will come to a sticky end. Well, perhaps we can use this as an excuse to look into a couple of words which can be quite confusing. And the first is wrath, as in the wrath of God. It's all too easy to assume that a word like this means the same thing when applied to God as it does when applied to us. But you have to remember that the words we use are forged in the business of talking about what we do, and then when we need to talk about God, there's not much choice but to take the nearest word that we've got and then learn how its meaning needs to be modified a bit when we use it of the Lord. Look at Nahum chapter 1 verses 2 and 3. There are two ideas there which contradict each other, or seem to contradict each other. One is that the Lord acts in wrath towards those who set themselves against him. And the second is that he is slow to anger. Now, if I'm filled with wrath, I shall go red in the face, my heart will pound, I shall probably raise my voice, I shall probably do and say things which then make it more difficult to restore relations with the person I'm upset with. Okay? Yeah. But there's no good reason to suppose that those human feelings and weaknesses apply to the Lord when he acts in wrath. So what does his wrath mean? Well, the best description I've found is this. If you remember the footsteps vision, that will remind you that your best day-to-day hypothesis is that the Lord is looking after you even when you're completely unaware of it. You're best to assume that's his normal mode. And that mode of operation involves in particular his breaking the chain of cause and effect on those occasions when we sin and the effect would be doing ourselves damage or doing other people damage as well. And on so many occasions it seems that he wards off many of what would be the proper consequences of our sin. But then there can come a point when we've gone so far wrong for so long that he has to let us learn the lesson a painful way. And the best documented ploy that he uses is to step back and allow us for once to suffer the proper consequences of what we've done. And that's what gets called his wrath. As to what the Lord feels like when he acts in wrath, I would have thought it was more sadness than anything that we would recognise as his getting lathered up in anger. That's the one word. The other word in these verses, the other idea, is the word vengeance or retribution. In verse 2 of chapter 1 again. Again, it seems quite out of character to picture God as getting all heated up, determined to get his own back on those who've offended him. What these words refer to is the fact that the Lord does have to right wrongs in some way at some time. Go back to Job and why do the wicked prosper? Well, a part of the answer has to be that they won't forever. Some of them might even prosper throughout their natural lives, but things will be set straight in the next life. The element of justice in the Lord is such that at or before the climax of our history on the last day, he will see that those who've stood by him in Jesus will be okay, and that the others will, because of that, lack something. It might sometimes be puzzling that he doesn't do it clearly all the time, but he can be relied on to do it eventually. That's his vengeance. It's the dark side of his offer of grace in Jesus. The sad fact that some won't take him up on the offer, and most obviously thereby suffer the consequences. And then let's turn to Habakkuk. I must confess to having been confused over the years as to whether this should be pronounced Habakkuk or Habakkuk, and I tend to meander between the two. You'll have to put up with it if I do that here, but I'll try not to. I'll try to call him Habakkuk. One of the main storylines in this book is that the Lord is going to raise up Babylon to seize, presumably, the land of Judah. Now, we don't have any clue as to who Habakkuk is, but this is at least a clue as to when he lived. That has to be sometime before the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BC, and probably not all that long before that. Well, actually, we do have just one clue who Habakkuk might have been. Chapter 3 is a psalm of prophecy, even down to including the musical directions. Verse 1 of chapter 3 speaks about Shigionoth, which could well be an indication as to what sort of tune to use for the psalm, and verse 19 gives directions that it's to be sung with stringed instruments. We know that certainly by the time of the restoration after the exile, there were many Levites who performed psalms and prophecies to music. It could be that Habakkuk was an early example of this, a Levite used to taking his turn in temple duties, even possibly used to using his music in the temple. Well, the main burden of Habakkuk is to get from the Lord some sort of explanation of how he can be the kind of God he is and still let the world go on as it does. When Job was asking his searching questions like why do the wicked prosper, it seems that he was primarily concerned with his own grasp of an explanation. He didn't like living without any sort of understanding of how such features of life could make sense. Another level on which the same kinds of issues can be faced is to ask how God himself can act consistently when these problems are present in his world. This is the problem of justifying God, of proving that God is just or righteous. In a word, theodicy, proving that, if we do it in Greek, theos is dikaios, proving that God is righteous. So what's the problem of God's righteousness? Well, the Bible proclaims various characteristics of God, his goodness, his justice, his holiness, his love, his faithfulness, his mighty power, and so on. So if that's what God is like, why does he allow, shall we say, the innocent to suffer? Why doesn't he stop it? Is it that he doesn't want to? Is it that he's not capable of doing so? Clearly, for the Old Testament and for a Christian, those explanations are unacceptable. They would destroy our fundamental idea of what God is like. So where do we go from there? Well, there are some possible answers to explore. The first is that the Lord has put the solution into our hands and expects us to play our part. If it's our responsibility to see, if, for instance, that the innocent don't suffer, then it's a problem if the Lord tries stepping in and doing it for us, because if he did that, it would destroy our own moral basis. And the other main kind of answer is that in the end the Lord will put things right and punish/destroy those who totally fail to live by his standards. The exile in Babylon is the prize example in the Old Testament where he punished his own people. Since then, has he punished his own people? Well, what about the rise of Islam in the Dark Ages? The main reason why Islam was able to advance so rapidly at that time was that the Church, Judaism, and the other local religions, Zoroastrianism, were all at least half asleep, and Islam met no serious challenge all the way from Persia to Spain. I don't think it's unreasonable to see that as God's judgment on the Church for letting go of its faith so seriously. Well, Habakkuk's oracle is in fact a dialogue between himself and the Lord, in which Habakkuk asks the questions and the Lord responds. It's not that easy to follow the Lord's answers, but the general drift seems to be that if everything isn't put right at the moment, it will be put right one day. This means that there's no attempt to take a picture of the world as it is now and claim that it all makes sense. The only sense to be found is if you're prepared to include the whole of the rest of human history and take it on trust that it will be put right in the end. Well, at that point we're going to pause, and you can resume with the third part of our study when you're ready. And so we start our last selection of items from the Book of the 12 with the prophecy of Zephaniah. After the time of Isaiah and Micah, there was a period of about 75 years or so without any recorded prophecy. During this time, Assyria was bullying Judah and required the people there to worship Assyrian gods. So Hebrew religion itself was at a pretty much all-time low point. The spiritual life of the nation comes alive again with the advent of King Josiah, the D historians, and the prophets Zephaniah, Nahum, and Jeremiah. At least Jeremiah and possibly the other two prophets lived to see the disaster which they all three foretold when Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar. We know nothing certain about the man Zephaniah, There are 3 other Zephaniahs in the Old Testament, and it's possible that the prophet is the same as one of the others, but that's guesswork, so we won't go there. One bit of guesswork that is quite nice, though, for Zephaniah to be old enough to minister as a prophet during Josiah's reign, he could well have been born in the reign of Manasseh the thug. That was a reign of terror, which makes some of the 20th century's people, sort of terror-mongering people, sort of look as if they're amateurs. The most obvious meaning of the word Zephaniah is the Lord hides, and it could have been given to him as a declaration of faith that the Lord would preserve this boy's life against all odds. It's not unusual for godly parents or their immediate friends to be given words of prophecy about their babies, and perhaps this is what happened then, and that this name Zephaniah was given to him in a very troublesome time as a word of prophecy. The content of the book. The first element within Zephaniah is a condemnation of Judah for having failed to live by her covenant law. Examples are given of the rich oppressing the poor, religious leaders with no spiritual sense, and ordinary people who are simply complacent. They should all know that the Lord has no alternative but to allow them to suffer the fate which they themselves have in effect created. Then there are condemnations of various foreign nations, and these people, of course, haven't broken Israel's covenant law because they're not part of the covenant, but they have done various things which must be counted against them. Zephaniah doesn't have to say what the Philistines have done wrong. Any Israelite could do that. But in chapter 2, verse 10, he condemns Moab and Ammon for mocking and insulting the Lord's people. In chapter 2, verse 15, Nineveh is condemned for thinking that only her affairs mattered in the entire world. For these sorts of reasons, these foreign nations are condemned and will be destroyed. There is one other element in Zephaniah. Chapter 3, verses 14 to 20, reads like the sort of thing you would expect someone to say to the exiles towards the end of the 70 years in Babylon. It's very similar to what the second Isaiah did say in Isaiah 40. For that reason, some people claim that these verses must have been added by another prophet at the sort of time to which they seem to refer. It is, of course, possible that they were by Zephaniah himself, picturing the time when the Lord's people will have suffered the punishment which he prophesied, and are in a position to hear a more gracious word from the Lord. And it is gracious. Chapter 3, verse 17 is often taken along with Luke 15, verses 7 and 10, picturing the delight in heaven when those who have been straying are brought back into the fold. It's a lovely picture. Let's go on to Haggai. It was 520 BC, 18 years since the Edict of Cyrus. That edict had allowed the Jews to return from Babylon to Jerusalem. Some sort of return had happened, some had returned, a governor had been appointed, a man called Zerubbabel, and there was a recognized high priest, Joshua. Having got back to Jerusalem, they rebuilt or repaired their houses and started trying to live normal lives there. And then came Haggai. We don't know where he came from, but he did appear, and he gave 4 short prophecies, all within the space of a year. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 14. The first of these was to the 2 leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua, telling them that it was time to start rebuilding the temple. The prophecy fired them with enthusiasm, and they got on with the job. They'd probably thought that rebuilding the temple would be a good idea, but they hadn't actually got started. It can't be easy sorting out your priorities when you return to a more or less completely ruined city. This seems to be very much like those times when there's a word of knowledge saying that the Lord wants to heal people with dodgy elbows. Up to that time, those ministering might have been quite willing to pray for people with dodgy elbows, and those suffering from dodgy elbows might have occasionally gone forward for ministry. But when that word of knowledge comes, the seekers seek and the ministers minister with greater expectation, and very often more happens on those occasions. I think that the announcement of the Lord's readiness to get on with the temple must have energized these men in much that same sort of way. In chapter 2, verses 1 to 9, the second prophecy simply says that the Lord is ready to bless the new temple as he did the old one. This is actually a useful piece of information because it declares that a rebuilt temple would not just be a human attempt to recover the past, but would again be a place where the representatives of the people could genuinely come before the Lord. This was not a trivial matter. The original temple had been built to house the Ark of the Covenant, and when the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the Ark was destroyed or lost or stolen and has never been seen since. Hence those silly films like Raiders of the Lost Ark. Silly but fun, really. It was a substantial theological point as to whether the Lord could and would meet with them in what many would have regarded as an empty temple. And this prophecy clearly said he would. Also in chapter 2, verses 10 to 19, the third prophecy, Haggai first establishes a point of Jewish law, that contact with a holy object does not make someone holy, although contact with an unclean or defiled object does make someone unclean. Before the temple rebuilding began, it was as if the city itself was in constant contact with something defiled, namely the ruined temple site. And once the rebuilding had begun, that site again became holy. No one should be surprised then that before the rebuilding began, harvests were poor and all sorts of things they tried doing didn't really work properly. The land, after all, was defiled by contact with that defiled site. Since then, there's been a distinct upturn in how things have gone for them as that defilement has been withdrawn. Verses 20 to 23 in chapter 2, the fourth prophecy, is a personal reassurance to Zerubbabel that the Lord wants to bless his leadership. He may have been appointed by the Babylonians, but the Lord will bless him as the current leader of the Lord's people. Just take a look at chapter 2, verse 3. Some people read this verse to imply that Haggai himself had seen the temple in its former glory. If he had, he would probably by the time of this prophecy have been in his 80s. And that gives hope to the rest of us who wonder what good things our old age holds for us. Now to Zechariah. We need to tackle the book of Zechariah in two parts, so let's do part one. It's probably the most difficult book in the Old Testament to read and understand, and it's made more difficult by the fact that there are two parts to the book which present quite different problems. For the moment, we're just looking at chapters 1 to 8. We come up against a block when we try to find out who Zechariah was. There are plenty of Zechariahs in the Old Testament, and various people have tried to identify the prophet with one or other of them, but there's been no general agreement. Zechariah himself makes the situation worse by varied references to himself as the son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo, or later just as the son of Iddo. The people who invent theories have had a field day with that one, but there's been, as far as I can see, no useful outcome. The precision with which Zechariah dates his oracles makes it a lot easier to say when he ministered. His ministry began in 520 BC, just a couple of months after Haggai's first prophecy, and it stretches for 2 years after that. So the scene is that some exiles have returned from Babylon, and the question has just been raised of rebuilding the temple. Before we look at some examples of what Zechariah said, Some points first about the style of his prophecy. Most of the prophets spoke in poetry of one sort or another, but these 8 chapters of Zechariah are almost entirely in prose. My own pondering on that is to wonder whether Zechariah wrote it before speaking it. That would mean there was no longer any need for the verse form to make it easier for people to remember something that hadn't been written down. Zechariah's words would be preserved by the writing which he'd already done. The other thing about his style is that he often sees things and communicates things in visions. This can raise enormous problems of interpretation. I mean, in any vision, you have to decide what details have a significance and which are just there because they're what he saw, or, as W.S. Gilbert said, to add dramatic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. And this job of working out what's important about the visions is made even more difficult by the fact that so many passages of Zechariah are quoted in the New Testament as prophecies about Jesus or about the kingdom of God, and it's hard for us to get that interpretation out of our heads in the effort to try and see what the prophecy might have meant originally. It's really awkward. Well then, what therefore about Zechariah and the rest of the Bible? In some ways, Zechariah is a pivot point between the Old Testament and the New. Zechariah himself quotes from several other prophets and puts his own gloss on their words. And then there are a lot of New Testament quotes from Zechariah which seem to treat his words much like he treated other people's. You know, they introduce a bit of new meaning into what they quote. I'm not going to set out to document this, but if you've got one of those Bibles that has in the margins a note of cross-references to other scripture passages, go through this first part of Zechariah and see just how many such references there are, both to other bits of the Old Testament and to New Testament stuff. Chapter 1, verses 7 to 17. Essentially, this prophecy has the same import as Haggai's first prophecy, that it was time for the temple to be rebuilt. But how different it is. Zechariah sees a vision. He talks with an angel in the vision. The angel talks with other angels, and you're left wondering whether the colours of the 4 horses have any significance. I suspect they don't, but that's only my guess. Then in verses 18 to 21, still in chapter 1, we have another vision. Clearly here horns represent powers, and the powers that have subjugated the Lord's people, and some other people are coming along to set them free. But there's no way I'm going to venture any more than that with this passage. And then chapter 2, the whole of the chapter, just deserves, I think, a wow. At a time when the practical necessity is to build the temple and the walls of Jerusalem in order to keep all the others out, Zechariah prophesies that the real essence of Jerusalem is to be a city without walls, because so many nations will one day flock to the place that the city will have to expand rapidly in order to accommodate them. The usual observation is that before the exile, you could have that kind of vision, say in Micah chapter 4, but that after the exile, even prophets could only talk about the need to keep the other nations out so that they could be punished while the Lord's people are being blessed. And Zechariah clearly rose above that. And my own pondering is that he might have benefited here from his studies of those predecessors of his as prophets whom he keeps quoting. He's perhaps learnt a lot from those previous prophets. In chapter 3, starts as a Zechariah-style prophecy to reassure the high priest Joshua that he will have a proper job to do and that by the grace of God he'll be fit to do it. But look at verses 8, 9 and 10. Here, Zechariah picks up a prophecy from Isaiah 11, which I would have said was one of the fundamental messianic prophecies, a promise of a new super king of the house of David, under whom the Lord's people will at last become what they've always been supposed to be. And verse 10 then says that under this branch the land will return to the peace it knew under Solomon, as in 1 Kings 4:25. But be careful about assuming straight away that Zechariah is thinking that this is a messianic prophecy. That might be jumping the gun. I think it would be. Chapter 4 is a word to Zerubbabel, the governor, to remember the intensely spiritual nature of his task. If he will do just what the Lord empowers him to do, and not what he might manage of his own strength, then the Lord will be able to bless his work. See, of course, especially verse 6. For the time being, the very sight of Zerubbabel holding a plumb line to help build the temple will be a huge encouragement to the people, and the 2 olive trees are then interpreted as the 2 who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth. Now you could translate the words in the Hebrew there as 2 messiahs, but that would be perilous. It doesn't fit anything else in the Old Testament or the New Testament to talk about 2 messiahs. So I think it's much safer to assume that the Lord is announcing that he's blessing Zerubbabel and Joshua, each in his own sphere of leadership, and anointing them for those leadership roles. In chapter 5, just as Zechariah has demanded high standards of the 2 leaders, so he adds prophecies which call on the ordinary people to put their sins behind them and live worthily of the new work that the Lord is doing. Chapter 6. The most interesting thing in this chapter is that a prophecy blessing the high priest Joshua actually labels him as the branch. So Zechariah is looking for such a powerful blessing on the ministry of Joshua that he will lead the nation into a new age. As far as we're concerned, this passage joins things like the royal psalms as looking for something which really couldn't fully happen at that time, but which did begin happening in the life, death and resurrection of another Joshua, the one who came from Nazareth. And then chapters 7 and 8. The prophet is approached as to whether people who have returned to Jerusalem should engage in the regular annual fasts, which had become their practice in exile. His response rambles rather, but the general drift I think is clear along 2 lines. The first is a bit like Amos. He seriously doubts that their fasting is from the heart anyway. It's a religious habit, therefore it has no real spiritual value. And the second is that the Lord is doing such great things that religious rituals like fasting really ought to be replaced with heartfelt rejoicing. The second of those, of course, rings a couple of bells in the ministry of Jesus. The first one, how Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding in Cana, and the clear implication of that being that what you get when Jesus is around is a whole lot more attractive than all those boring washing ceremonies which were so important in Judaism at the time. But the other is when Jesus is directly asked the question about fasting, and his reply is that fasting may have its place, but while he's around, it's just not appropriate. Luke 5:33-35. Jesus follows that remark with the parable of the wineskins, clearly reiterating that the old religious system cannot tolerate the new thing that the Lord is doing. It needs new ways and new worship. Right, there's nothing for it. We've now got to do part 2 of Zechariah, chapters 9 to 14. And they're a lot more difficult to come to terms with than the first 8 chapters. There are none of the explicit dates which are given repeatedly in the first 8 chapters. There's very little by way of clues as to which period it's addressing. The clues that are there suggest that it's not addressed to a period of peace and restoration like the first 8 chapters, but to a time of struggle when the Lord's people were directly under threat. And the vision style which we find in the first 8 chapters gets even more difficult to follow in the remaining part of the book. Even really conservative scholars are by no means sure that this section is the work of the same prophet as the first bit. If it is, then the only way that you can make sense of it is to say that it must have been quite a few years later, possibly at the end of Zechariah's life, when the prevailing circumstances had thoroughly changed. An oddity. When Matthew was telling the story of Judas and the 30 pieces of silver, he finds a mention of 30 pieces of silver in the Old Testament. Matthew 27 verse 9. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 silver coins, the price set on him by the people of Israel. Now, the only mention of 30 pieces of silver in the Old Testament is in Zechariah 11 verse 12. One possibility is that Matthew just got it wrong. I think Matthew did make some blunders occasionally. Another possibility is that he was right, and that this part of Zechariah is indeed by Jeremiah, and by some curious turn of events has ended up in the wrong book. Certainly the times of Jeremiah fill the bill, in that the nation was then seriously under threat, and it was their own stupid fault for being so unfaithful to the Lord. There are some scholars who base their reading of chapters 9 to 14 on this assumption. Most, however, assume that it must have been written some time later than the first 8 chapters, probably even 1 or 2 centuries later, and that it was seen in some way as a continuation of Zechariah's ministry. There are a number of similarities of style between the 2 parts of Zechariah, so it could well have been written by those who were preserving the work of Zechariah himself. But no one knows. The awkward thing then is that we don't have any concrete historical situation into which to look for what some of these prophecies might have meant in their original setting. Some are pretty obvious, but others are anything but obvious. The real issue in some of the passages is that a Christian wants to view so many of these prophecies as messianic, but that most scholars have a reluctance to assume that this was what all these prophecies were originally. I must confess that I feel myself drawn with some passages here into thinking that right from the start they were reaching out beyond any solution which the immediate future might bring, reaching out to a complete change in the way that the Lord would deal with his people and the mess they'd got into. So, Zechariah chapter 9 verses 1 to 8. This is the sort of thing you find as the restoration bit in a number of prophets. The enemy will be vanquished, and the Lord's people will have a new delight in living with their God. But so in chapter 9 verses 9 to 13, it's altogether different. This sounds for all the world like one of those coronation psalms which peddle impossibly inflated hopes for the reign of the new king. But there were no kings after the exile. And what are the Greeks doing in verse 13? They didn't come on the scene for a couple of centuries after Zechariah. But this is one of the bits in which I suspect a prophet was envisaging not a return to the old monarchy before the exile, but an improvement on that, a move forward to a monarchy which would receive the blessing of God as never before. And why the donkey? Well, perhaps the prophet has gone far enough to apply to this super king the word that the original Zechariah gave to Zerubbabel in Zechariah 4 verse 6. Perhaps the prophet can see that only a king entirely robbed of earthly pomp could be the focus of the new age to which he's reaching out. One thing you must be very careful to avoid is to think that Zechariah had some sort of picture of Jesus in his mind. I think all the evidence suggests that even the messianic prophecies came together in bits and pieces and didn't really make sense together until Jesus actually appeared. And even then, most people didn't connect the sort of person that Jesus was to any sort of messianic expectation. Chapter 10 This is the sort of moan about the shepherds, that is, rulers of the Lord's people, which you can find in several other prophets, not least Ezekiel. It's accompanied, as we would expect, with a promise of gracious restoration. Chapter 11 has been called the most difficult passage in the Old Testament to interpret. It uses the imagery of shepherds as the rulers of Israel, and we get what we expect by way of a condemnation of rotten shepherds and even the dismissal of some. And then the prophet himself plays the role of a new shepherd who seems to start out all right, but the people don't give him a chance to rule in righteousness. And the result is that the covenant is broken, the quite promising shepherd becomes a rotten one like the rest, and what follows? Doom. Clearly this prophet would have known Ezekiel 34 on the true shepherd. It must have been a quite deliberate statement that the time of the new shepherd didn't turn out to be quite as good as it should have been. But quite what period of history this refers to, no one knows. It's a complete mystery. Chapter 12, verses 1 to 9. It's difficult with this sort of passage to tell whether the prophet thought he was foretelling a significant event in the not-too-distant future, or something more to do with the culmination of history. It is, of course, possible that it was both, a not-too-distant future event which the prophet thought would be part of the end times. My guess is that any attachments to the end times has been done since the prophet and not by him. Still in chapter 12, verses 10 to 14, this is another passage that makes you go, wow. It has proved just about impossible to say what the prophet thought he was talking about here. The first assumption with prophecy is always that a prophet is talking about something in his own time or the immediate future, so that his announcing the prophecy is a way of helping the people to be in a fit state to deal with the event or to avert it. But it's easy to see what became of this prophecy once it got into the New Testament. John 19 verse 37 directly quotes this passage as that they will look to the one they have pierced. And Revelation 1:7 picks up the not at all obvious word pierced as well, and follows it with a description of the people's mourning, again clearly referring to this passage. In connection with the Jesus event, the sequence of ideas is then interesting. Someone is pierced, and under the influence of a spirit sent from God, people mourn, and then, look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn because of him. I see there the same sort of sequence of ideas that we find in John 16, verses 8 to 11, where the coming Holy Spirit, it says, will convict people of sin, righteousness and judgment, all in the wake of what happened to Jesus. Chapter 13, verses 1 to 6. A couple of on that day oracles, looking to the purity which the Lord will then bring about among his people. There has obviously been some trouble with false prophets, and a second oracle looks for this to end. On that day, people who have been prophets, that is, false prophets, will deny that that's what they've been. Like Amos, they'll lay claim to be farmers or shepherds instead. I never was a prophet, honest. And chapter 14. This is uncompromisingly an end times prophecy. There will be a great battle over Jerusalem. The nations who have opposed the Lord's people will be defeated and will be struck with a flesh-rotting plague, but survivors from those nations will come and seek to join in the paradise returned, which Jerusalem will then have become. We're much more familiar with these images in the extended meditations on them that which occupy a prominent place in the book of Revelation. Zechariah was unsurprisingly one of John's favourite hunting grounds for meditation material. And so, lastly, to the book of Malachi. He's another prophet whom we can't identify. In fact, he probably wasn't even called Malachi. because that just means my messenger, and that's a pretty fair description to give to any prophet. There is a theory that the material in Malachi was originally in the collection of pieces which were stuck on the end of Zechariah, and that an editor at some point gave them a separate existence merely to make the number of prophets in this book become the magic number 12. Who knows? The most attractive theory of when this prophet ministered is that he was a contemporary of Nehemiah. The exiles had been allowed to return to Jerusalem, but they'd only come back in dribs and drabs over a century or so. The temple had been rebuilt, but the city of Jerusalem is still rather a mess, not least its walls. The prophecies of the second Isaiah had led them to think that everything would be wonderful when they returned. But they were still the same sinners when they returned as their ancestors had been before them, when the punishment of exile became necessary, and they made a dreadful mess of their lives. Well, Malachi has the job, yes, of calling for renewed righteousness, but also of assuring them that the Lord does still love them. If they fall to thinking that he's given up on them, then they are quite simply wrong. The opening of chapter 1, verses 2 to 6, is a word of assurance that the Lord still loves them like he always has done. Verse 7 through into verse 16 of chapter 2, a selection of condemnations of the people, particularly the priests in the temple. They even shut the temple doors so that people don't see that they're not bothering to light the altar fire to make the proper sacrifices. Shock, horror. I mean, genuine shock, horror. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 5 describe what the Lord will in the end do to right these wrongs. The Lord will come into his temple in judgment, and who shall stand when he does? And then the remainder of chapter 3. The Lord calls for the people as a whole to return to godly living, focus not least in the practice of tithing. The Lord doesn't want their money, of course. He wants the opportunity to bless them. And then chapter 4. The day of the Lord again. A warning, in fact, that the promised day of the Lord will be a day of judgment for those who have lived in defiance of his laws. But we must end by looking particularly at verses 5 and 6. This is an intriguing note on which the usual English editions of the Old Testament finish. The Hebrew Bible doesn't have this lot at the end, but the English versions usually do. Elijah was the archetypal prophet, all the more enigmatic because of the end of his life with no apparent dying. Future prophetic ministries are seen, in a sense, as a continuation of Elijah's ministry. The Lord's purpose is not then just to come and flatten all mankind. I mean, in the Noah covenant he undertook not to do that anymore. It is rather to give a real opportunity to people to repent, to return to his ways. Gracious he is to the last. And that is where we stop our bit on the Book of the 12. I'm not going to try summing up the very disparate bits and pieces that we found in here, but we may just stop. And may God bless you.